Last Sunday morning we began to talk about Abram, who will be Abraham as we go on through Scripture. But at the point in time where he is called out from the Ur of Chaldee to Haran, where his father dies, and then God calls him on, even before his father's death, but God called him on by himself with his family and with his nephew, his dead brother's son, to go on to Canaan, where God would give him the land. God would make him a blessing. God would make him a nation that would be a blessing to people of all the world. And so he followed and went there. And when he got there, this is what we studied on Wednesday night. When he got there, God's will had a famine in mind. Now, why in the world would God do that? When you get saved, isn't that supposed to mean that all your problems go away? And here, he left a populated, well-watered place, came to Canaan, and when he got to Canaan, God had a famine waiting on him. Abram just didn't understand that. And often when we get in the middle of God's will, God's got something there to test us, and we don't understand God testing us in that way. And so we begin scheming and trying to figure out a way around that, because certainly that's not of God. So God's answer must be something that he wants me to figure out here, so I'll just kind of conjure up an idea and follow that myself. Even though God told me to come here, but I got here and there's a famine, so something went haywire along the way. Well, Abram decided that he needed to go to Egypt. He just came from a populated area, got here in the wilderness, there's famine. He's not used to that. He goes to the next closest populated area, which is Egypt. He goes down to Egypt at the end of chapter 12. And in Wednesday night we studied how in Egypt he told his wife to tell everybody she's my sister, because nobody gets better treated than the brother of a good-looking gal. And so she was a beautiful lady, so he went into Egypt saying to tell everybody your sister. And it worked from his standpoint for him, selfishly. He put his wife in a horrible position. Pharaoh himself took her into the palace preparing to marry her, gave him all of these herds and all of these riches in exchange for her hand in marriage. So he's out there counting his sheep and counting his cows and counting his cash, while she's in there wondering, God, what kind of husband did you give me? What is next to happen to me here? And Abram has allowed this to just become a bad situation. He brought his wife Sarai, Lot, and all their entourage there to Egypt, and now this horrible thing has happened. God intervened, we found out Wednesday night, and caused sickness to come into Pharaoh's house, and Pharaoh said, "What have you done?" So Abraham lost his testimony. Pharaoh doesn't want to hear the 4 spiritual laws from Abram at all because of what Abram's done to him. He says, keep everything and just get out of here. Get out of Egypt. And so Abram left Egypt a richer man, but a very poor man, because he has sacrificed the will of God. He had actually taken the woman to whom God had promised to bring the seed of the Messiah and allowed her to go potentially into the harem of the Pharaoh. He had put the very hope of the gospel in danger because he didn't want to be in danger himself, being known as her husband, and what the Egyptians might do to try to get her and get rid of him. He didn't trust God in the famine. He didn't trust God in Egypt either. He was going through a period of unbelief, and because of that trip to Egypt, we see that he planted some seeds of destruction in his life. Some things in the future are going to happen because of Abram's decision to not trust God in a difficult situation. To try to get this idea about Christianity that everything's supposed to be blessing, blessing, blessing by my definition of blessing, and that God never tests me, God never disciplines me, God never strengthens me by some difficult things, some less than things that I would choose, things I wouldn't really want on my own agenda. I don't wake up in the day and say, I want this difficulty, this problem, I want this thing to come into my life today. But God's list for us often is this and this and this, because God wants us to get to here. My kids don't want to go to school and say, oh boy, I'm looking forward to this test here, I'm looking forward to having to do this report here. But with everything that they do along that agenda, they become stronger and smarter and wiser. as they go through that process. So in chapter 13, after Abram went down to Egypt, it's said in chapter 12, which is a spiritual journey as well as a physical journey. Now in chapter 13, we find that Abram is going back up to where God had spoke to him in Canaan. When he first got to Canaan, God spoke to him between Bethel and Ai, where he built an altar. And God reaffirmed the promise that God had given him by calling him out of the Ur of the Chaldees, calling him out of Aram. And God had told him he'd make him a blessing and a great nation. And so Abraham went back to there. And if you are in sin, if you are backsliding, you need to slide back to where you and God separated. He had made a decision to leave that altar earlier in the middle of a famine and walk down to Egypt. Now he needed to get back to where he and God were healthy at a time. And if you have gravitated out of God's will, maybe you need to think of the last place you and God were really together. And to go back to that place. Go back to those study habits you had. Go back to those prayer habits you had in your life. And get back walking with God. And so Abraham, it says, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had. Well, he had lots of stuff now. Remember, he really prospered, so to speak, while he was in Egypt because of Pharaoh and his lies. And Lot went with him. Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and in gold. From the Negev, he went from the place to place until he came to Bethel, which means house of God. To the place between Bethel and Ai. Ai means ruin. So here he is with Bethel on the west, Ai on the east. Where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar, there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. So he went back to that place. He couldn't get right with God while he's still in Egypt. He had to get rid of, he had to repent and get rid of what had drawn him away. Go back to where he had been with God originally, and there get his life back on target. But he came back wealthy. His time in the world, his time of compromise, had made him wealthy. Now, we often think that, well, if this prospers me, then it must be God's blessing in my life. But the blessing that he picked up in Egypt, that he called a blessing, the livestock and the wealth, was really a curse. It was part of the curse that was going to bring problems into his household. We often think that if I'm making more money here, or if if I get more benefits here, then this must be God's place for me. God always answers by opening the bank account. Well, Abram had just, I'm going to do that a lot, I know. Abram had just caused himself a major stumbling block in the future. By going down to Egypt, even though he came back with more problems than he had answers. Some things that it had cost him, he had lost time. Whenever we invest in sin, you lose time for God's purposes. God has given you just enough time on this earth to do his will for your life. So every time you choose other than his will, then you've lost some blessing, some growth period. You have lost some advantage in your life. Abraham could have grown in his faith by sticking through the famine. He opted out for the famine, went to Egypt, and caused problems down there, brought problems back, where if he would have just stayed where God wanted him to be, then he would have grown spiritually, and God would have blessed him there, and he would have seen a side of God he had yet to see. Second thing he lost was his testimony. He lost his testimony, obviously, to Pharaoh. He lost the testimony he could have had by being God's person in Canaan. During the famine, like Joseph, became exalted in Egypt because he stayed where God wanted him to be in the midst of a famine, and God blessed him and used him in a great way. He also lost his testimony to his wife. Certainly she didn't think as high of him as she had maybe thought earlier because of what he had done to her to save his own skin. So he lost his testimony. A third thing is they picked up a servant girl while they were there in Egypt. Her name was Hagar. Because of that, you're going to find out that the Arabs are going to become those who live right next to the Jews, even to our day today. Because Hagar would be the woman by whom the Arabs would begin coming out through history. So they picked her up, and so that brought judgment not only upon his household and the turmoil that would cause there, but also to Jews throughout history that would bring judgment. The added wealth, which seems to be a blessing to him, was going to be a curse, and we're going to see that in just a moment. How much wealth does God want for your household? When is it more than what God has designed? You know, the world can give you wealth. It can pile it on there. God only has so much that he wants for you to be living and using. What is God's determined wealth for you? Well, if you've got so much possession or wealth that draws you away from God, that keeps you from giving to God, which makes you possessive, which makes you greedy, which makes you distracted from the will of God, you've got all these toys now that keep you from being where God would want you to be, then the world's wealth has come in. That's not God's blessing. That is the world's temptation and the world stealing away from you that number one thing that should be the priority in your life, and that is your commitment to Christ during your time upon this earth. So Abraham had more than God's wealth, and it was being used against him. And number 5 was the consequence of Lot. Lot went to Egypt with him. Lot had come with him to Canaan. Lot could have seen Abram standing by God. Lot could have been built up in his faith. Lot could have been a different person if they would have stuck through the famine. But because they went to Egypt, and Lot saw Egypt, you can bring Lot back out of Egypt, but often you can't get Egypt out of Lot. And we're going to find out here that Lot is a changed person here. He made the difficult decision of heading out into nowhere because God had called his uncle. But his uncle took him, sacrificed his own testimony by taking him into Egypt, exposing him to all that was in Egypt. And when Lot comes back out, Lot is a little bit wiser in the world's ways. They had all this stuff because they had gone. In verse 5 it says, Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. So Lot probably got away like a bandit too. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. All this extra stuff kept them from comfortably living together. The famine would have cut some things out. You know, there's nothing better sometimes, and Lynn and I talked about this morning, you know, how stuff can just be more of a curse than a blessing. When you got, because there's some people down the road who are going into evangelism, and they're selling everything. They're going to live in a motorhome, and they're selling everything that they've accumulated through the years, and they've got a garage sale that just goes beyond the garage into the house. You know, selling the house and everything is going up for sale. And the idea of just getting all this junk out of the way, and how often it controls us rather than us controlling it. And here they had all these things that no longer allowed them to comfortably live together. And people can get wealthy, they can have all these things in their home, but often it doesn't allow them to live together anymore. Things get between them in their relationship. Things don't allow there be enough room in the house for everybody to live comfortably anymore, so friction comes out of it. And before you know it, someone's moving out, or the kids need to get out earlier than maybe they should have, and so it just causes problems. In Taiwan, whenever a son would marry, they just build another room onto the house. The house would start out like this, and you'd know how many kids or sons they had by how many little added areas that they had, because the sons would bring the wife home, and they would begin to work the land with the parents, and you just add a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. They don't have the limitations that we have in America with all our possessions that we have. And Lot and Abram had brought all these possessions into their relationship, and because of that, there was quarreling, it says, that started. Quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot, and the Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. I wonder why God put that on there. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were here as if they were watching the quarreling of God's two folks in the land. Here were God's people. Here were the two churches in town, and they're fighting while the Canaanites and the Perizzites are watching it go on. You just wonder if God put that in there for us in the future to realize that the Canaanites are in the land. They're watching our herdsmen. They're watching what's going on in the church. This quarreling kept going on, and the only answer was to separate. That wasn't God's answer originally, I'm sure. But that was the answer that it came to be after Abram and Lot could no longer be sustained together because of all the wealth they had accumulated, not by God's blessing. Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. Let's separate. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right, and if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Abram had three tests. Number one was circumstances. He made an F. He didn't want to face the famine, so he went to Egypt. So he failed there. Number two was people. Instead of dealing with the circumstances in Canaan, he went to deal with the people in Egypt, and he lost out there. He lost his testimony. He endangered his wife. He polluted the heart of his nephew, so he failed that test as well. And the third was going to be things. He's making a decision here whether he's going to take the good land or allow Lot to get back to trusting God again, allow Lot to make that decision. And just like he didn't trust God in the decision of the famine, he's going to trust God to guide Lot, to put him in the right place with this decision about which way to separate. Well, Lot's got Egypt in his heart. And when Lot looks west toward Bethel, and he sees this is not the most advantageous land that there is here in town, and then he turns back toward Ai, which is ruin, and he sees this well-watered plain, and it's described this way, which was like Egypt. He said, that's where I want to be. That gave him a little remembrance about where he had just spent the period of time with his nephew, and where he had all these flocks and everything brought from. And so Lot looked toward Sodom. Said Lot looked up and saw the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, toward Zoar. This was before Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan, and he set out toward the east, and the two men parted company. Lot had a problem with pride. Pride should have said that the younger will allow the older to make that decision. The one who's wiser should make that choice. Lot had pride in his heart now, so he jumped on the decision that Abraham offered to him. We wouldn't think Lot was saved, probably, if we didn't have 2 Peter, which said that he was a righteous man. But he was a righteous man tormented with carnality. And because of that, Lot made the carnal choice. And he went toward Ai instead of toward Bethel. The second thing we see about Lot is his heart of unbelief. He looked by sight instead of by faith. He saw by sight that this was well watered out there. And so because of that, he said, that's where I want to go because it looks good to me. You guys in Sunday school, in adult Sunday school, why did Eve choose to eat? Because the fruit was delightful, desirable to the eye. Desirable to make one wise, delightful to the eye. And so that drew her away because she was looking by sight instead of by faith. And the third thing is that he had worldliness in his heart. And this represented worldliness. Not only was it well watered out there, but on the other side was Sodom. Big town. Here out in the middle of nowhere, it's the closest thing to Egypt that you're going to find. And so all this attracted him. And so Lot gets all his herds, he gets his wife, he gets his two daughters, and they head out toward Sodom to live close to Sodom, out in the well-watered plains toward the Jordan Valley. So it says, Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. His decision was to get him closer to sin. He didn't jump right in Sodom, but he got closer to sin. Abram went toward the house of God, toward Bethel, but Lot went toward Ai, toward ruin. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south and east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go and walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. If you are a Christian today, you are part of that dust. You are part of Abram's offspring that God gave him on that day because you are in Christ. And Christ is one of those who are in the loins of Abram right here at this point in time. If you notice here, everything that Lot thought he was getting, he lost. He chose the better. He went out there, possessed this land, but eventually he came out with nothing more than himself and just his two daughters. Everything Abram chose, God promised forever. You may think you're making a choice to benefit your bank account, to give you some possessions, give you more of a standard of living, more control and power down at work. But if it's not God's choice, it's only temporary. It's going to just slide out of your hand at a point in time. When its season is over, you'll no longer possess it. It certainly won't take it into heaven with you. Lot is a picture of somebody that Paul told about in 1 Corinthians 3, that they made it to heaven, but everything they possessed burned up in the judgment. Lot's judgment, when fire fell upon Sodom, was destroying everything he had. While Abram is out here daily coming out and speaking with God and growing more rich, and God giving him more land and giving him more family and more possessions out there because he chose God's direction, and God in God's timing gave him these things. While Abram chose Lot chose the world's way and tried to rush in to the possessions that God had not designed for his life to possess. First he looked, then he pitched his tent. And we get later on in Genesis, we're going to find out he's inside the city limits, sitting at the gates. Lot made a choice because a seed got planted in his heart. And instead of dealing with that before the Lord, coming with Abram back to that altar, confessing sin and getting back right with God, that seed continued to prepare for its harvest. And that harvest came when Lot was given that decision. I bet you Abram was wanting Lot to not choose that direction. If God doesn't want us to choose sin, but often we're given the option of sin. And when we're given the option, the heart of God is wanting us not to make that choice. But until we reject the sin, we really haven't made the choice for God. So God allows those choices out there that are the choices for evil, the choices for Sodom. But those choices are ones he'd hopefully never make. And Lot could have never made that choice. And if he hadn't, then he would have probably shared with Abram that Abram wouldn't have chosen that direction. He wouldn't have chosen to gravitate more towards sin. Because the closer you get to sin, the more you choose that way, the more sin, like gravity, just pulls you toward it and draws you in. And a person walking with God is going to avoid that gravity zone that will just pull you right in, suck you right in, closer and closer to sin, deeper and deeper into it. It says, Abraham moved his tent and he went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. So you can see they separated. They went two different directions. Here is Abraham, the altar of the Lord. And here is Lot with an altar to sin, the city of Sodom. A place that is on the list for God to destroy is just a matter of time. It's a temporal place where this altar of the Lord is going to be a place for generations. Until the end of time, God will honor that kind of altar. And you're making decisions today about your own life. You're making decisions that Abram and Lot made. Abram made his mistakes, but he came back and made the right decision. You may have made your mistakes, but on a day like today, you can come back and make the right decisions for the future. Or you can allow those decisions that you've made in the past to become seed that will begin to destroy your future. Because if you don't deal with it now, you may not only not deal with it in the future, but it may just produce a harvest in your soul that will cause a destruction that will affect more than just yourself. It will affect your whole family, your whole testimony, your whole ministry, your whole ability to be used for the kingdom of Christ? What is that area for you today? Where is that place between Bethel and Ai that you stand today in your life? That you need to get off the fence. Either go west with God or go east with Lot. Would you bow with me?